Seeking the truth never gets old, even when it hides in the shadows. Immerse yourself in the world of June's Journey, a free-to-play hidden object game set in the roaring 20s. Solve the mystery of the devious gossip spreader and celebrate our 7th anniversary with exclusive events, never-before-seen decorations, thrilling mysteries, and exciting giveaways. The adventure and the gossip awaits. Are you ready for the journey? Download June's Journey today for free on Android or iOS.
Salve, meu povo! Aqui é o Igão. Ó, ouvindo um podcast no caminho do trabalho ou enquanto prepara a comida? Acertei? Mas uma coisa que eu sei é que cê tá aí no corre. Hoje em dia, todo mundo é correria. Parece até que o dia tem mais de 24 horas. É por isso que Rexona te dá muito mais proteção para você encarar a sua rotina. Rexona, proteção superior a 72 horas por dia. Rexona não te abandona.
Hi everyone. Before we get into today's episode, I would like to shout out Operation Olive Branch. Operation Olive Branch is a volunteer-powered grassroots collective effort to connect with and amplify Palestinian voices in an effort to support their critical needs, which include but are not limited to their mutual aid requests. Operation Olive Branch has collected the mutual aid campaign information of over 800 families on a detailed spreadsheet in hopes of enhancing the families' accessibility and reach to potential donors and advocates. These pre-existing campaigns are created and managed by the families themselves. Operation Olive Branch's role is simply to amplify them. The other leg of their operation occurs on social media, where a growing number of advocates share their privilege and reach by making videos and hosting live streams to raise funds for these families. You can find this spreadsheet of mutual aid requests, as well as more information about Operation Olive Branch at Operation Olive Branch on Instagram and TikTok, or visit linktree/OP Olive Branch. I've put these links in the show notes for this episode as well. Hello, and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and I wanted to shout out, I should have done it last week, but I forgot to, the new theme music that we have for this season. So we're stepping lots of things up this season. We have new beautiful artwork by Deborah Wong, and we have a new theme song performed by actual musicians. And so they are a group called the Severn Duo. For the first 4 years of Vulgar History, it was kind of, it was just a clip art piece of music that I chose when I did the first episode, and that became the theme song of the show. And I know there's so many podcasts I listen to that have theme music, and I find it reassuring, and so I hope that this one feels like the old one, but now, it's stepped up in this beautiful way by the Severn Duo, who are a group based in the UK, and they could play at your wedding. They can do recorded music for you. You go to severnduo.com to learn more about them. And also, it was important to me as we were getting ready for this season to take the opportunity to extend the overall framework of the show, which is really like real human people doing work, to the music as well. So in terms of that, Aveline Malik from The Wardery is a real human being who I get to do the transcripts, which you can find at vulgarhistory.com, like I say at the end of every episode. Christina Lumagi is a real person doing the editing. And also all of the artwork that I have on merch is in our 2 merch stores is designed by human artists. It's just, there's so many things coming out right now. People talking about like AI and what can it do to help and stuff. And it's always been important to me to support real people. And now that extends to the theme song as well. Oh, and I will also say in terms of like crediting people where credit is appropriate. So the picture that we have for this season is of my face, which you might not be familiar with my face or what I look like, but you are, because it's always incorporated into the artwork of the show. So I took my face and put it over a famous painting of Marie Antoinette. So again, Deborah Wong is the artist who did the artwork of me. And if you want to see the complete artwork that Deborah did, if you go to patreon.com/AnneFosterWriter on your computer, it's the header image. So it's kind of like me looking like Marie Antoinette, eating some cake. There's 5 cakes in front of me. My cat Hepburn is there. It's a beautiful piece of work. And it was inspired by a real human artist whose name is Elizabeth Viglet-Lebrun, who is a contemporary of Marie Antoinette. They were pals. And so Marie Antoinette, ostensibly the patron saint of this season, the theme of this season. And I do mean that she is. Like, that's why it's one of her portraits that inspired this artwork that we have. because everything is building up to telling Marie Antoinette's story, but her story is so intimately connected with what was happening around the world, like the French Revolution. And the French Revolution was inspired by other revolutions that were happening in other places. And that's why we're looking at not Versailles. We're not talking about like that time she did cosplay as a young shepherdess, although we are going to be getting into that stuff in later episodes. If you're like, but I want to hear about Marie Antoinette now, I do recommend some of my podcast friends are Katie and Nathan from the Queen's podcast, which if you don't listen to them, it's got a very similar vibe to Vulgar History, except there's two of them talking. So twice is fun. They did a really good episode about Marie Antoinette several years ago, debunking a lot of stuff about her and just kind of celebrating who she really was. So we're going to get there eventually, but it's going to be a lengthy journée. So we have done similar sorts of things on this podcast, although this is, again, season 7 and things are stepping up in different ways. Like I did the Mary Queen of Scots series. I did the Lady Jane Grey series. So the closer we get to Marie Antoinette, the more it's going to be similar to those series where we're going to look at like her family and her friends. But we're like starting out pretty far-flung, just kind of being like the world, the society. It's like if somebody was doing a biographical podcast about me and they'd be like, oh, well, she lives in Saskatoon in Canada, they might want to start with like the founding of Canada or like the fur trade, like just kind of like to establish like what is this world that I live in, what does it look like? And Marie Antoinette is similar. But speaking of previous seasons that we've done, so season I think 3 was Lady Jane Grey, How to Lose a Queen in 9 Days, and there's a new series on, I believe it's Amazon Prime, called My Lady Jane, which is based on a book that sort of takes Lady Jane Grey's story and gives it kind of a whimsical, supernatural, sort of the Princess Bride sort of vibe. Anyway, there's a TV show. So I love to see Lady Jane Grey having a whole TV show about her. Some of the sort of teaser art they have about it showed her standing with her sisters, Lady Catherine Grey, Lady Mary Grey, heroines we've also talked about on this podcast before. Recently, another previous Vulgar History heroine, La Chevalière d'Eon, made quite a substantive appearance on the TV show Franklin, Benjamin Franklin, starring Michael Douglas on Apple TV+. And then also in June, next month, there's a new movie coming out called Firebrand, which is the story of Catherine Parr, who we've also talked about on Vulgar History. She's the 6th wife of Henry VIII. And also Anne Askew, who we've talked about on the podcast, is in this movie. So it's like a beautiful time for Vulgar History's subjects who are often not the most famous of women to suddenly be on TV and movies. And one loves to see it. Every time one of my girls is on a TV show or movie, it just makes me so happy. So I'm hoping still one day, I mean, I will lose my mind if and when there's a Fredegund versus Brunhild TV show. Oh, and I forgot to say there's also, in terms of Vulgar History heroines being on things, there's a show on Stars that just wrapped up, Mary and George, this like very audacious and fun and sexy TV series starring Julianne Moore and Nicholas Gallant-Seen, which features in several episodes Frances Howard, the original fairy godmother of the show. So she's on there as well. So just like, it's great. And that connects with today's topic, which is Constanze Mozart, who appears in a movie called Amadeus, because Constanze Mozart, famous last name, was the wife and then widow of Amadeus Mozart. And in the movie Amadeus, she made quite an effect on me. I watched that movie a couple years ago as part of our Patreon series that I do called Vulgar Peace Theater, where my friends Lana and Allison and I watch a costume drama and then kind of talk about it and have a nice time. And Constanze's role in that was she was fun and cute and flirty, very low-cut gowns, very tits out sort of attitude. But I've never really learned about what she was like at all. I do want to mention, in terms of the Amadeus Vulgar Peace Theater episode, if after you listen to this, you want to hear my take on that movie, that is available on Patreon for anyone who pledges at least $5 or more. You can hear that and all the other episodes of Vulgar Peace Theater. Anyway, so today's guest talking about Constanze Mozart is Kristin Franseen. And it was a beautiful moment of synchronicity when I was working on planning this season. Actually, she reached out to me saying like, hey, I've just updated this encyclopedia entry about Constanze Mozart. Is that someone you'd like to have on the podcast? And I thought, well, that's exactly the sort of person that I want to talk about this season, which is kind of like a lesser known woman who is living during the 18th century, this revolutionary era, and also who is connected to Marie Antoinette in ways we're going to get to at the end of this episode. So Kristin was a postdoctoral fellow in history at Concordia University. She's an alumni of McGill University in musicology. One of her specialties is gossip in music history. When I read that, when she first reached out to me, I was like, had I known when I was doing my undergraduate degree in history that you could then go on to specialize in gossip in music history, or like one of my previous guests did, to do your PhD in bushranging and banditry. I didn't know, but now you know. If anyone out there is a history bachelor student, like choose something real weird and you can do a master's in it or even a PhD in it. Anyway, she explains her research interest a lot better than I just did in the episode. And one final caution, I guess I'm going to say, coming up in this episode, I draw a parallel between the story of Constanze Mozart and the 1976 BBC miniseries, I, Claudius, which I was watching and obsessing over while I was preparing this season. It has nothing to do with Marie Antoinette. That just happens to be the TV show that I was finding comfort in while I was recording this. So it's a 1976 British miniseries available on the Acorn streaming service. It's about the ancient Roman royal family. So like Augustus, Tiberius, Livia, Agrippina, who has been in Vulgar History. So I guess I could kind of count that for myself as an appearance of a Vulgar History girly. And I think, anyway, I want to clarify what that is because in several episodes coming up this season, including this one, I'm going to just like drop into a conversation comparisons to I, Claudius. You might be like, what is she talking about? But now you know what I'm talking about. And in fact, if you look up on Instagram, I've made a bingo sheet for season 7, part 1 of Vulgar History. And one of the squares is, in fact, Anne brings up I, Claudius, because this is why I'm preparing you. I'm going to bring this up at unexpected times in various episodes. I don't know if you can hear that. That's Hepburn, my cat, the famous cat from the image at patreon.com/AnneFosterWriter. It's a really good likeness of her. Anyway, she's excited. Here is Kristin Franseen talking about Constanze Mozart. So I'm joined today by Kristin Franseen to talk about Constanze Mozart. She has a lot more names than that, but we're just going to go with Constanze Mozart. Yes. Welcome, Kristin.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. This is fun.
Yeah. Could you first, well, actually, you were the one who approached me to suggest this, so I'm excited you're here because it fits in so perfectly with the theme of this season.
Yeah.
Can you explain your interest in Constanze Mozart, how you first started reading up on her?
Yeah, so I work on the history of gossip and anecdote in classical music. And
first of all, amazing. That's amazing. I keep finding historians who have these specialties where I'm like, if I had known that you could specialize like that when I was in my undergraduate, I might have made different choices. Okay, so the history of gossip and anecdote.
Yeah, I did not know that this was something you could do. And then I was writing my dissertation on early 20th century queer writings on 18th and 19th century music. And I kept running into all of these folks in like 1910 who were sharing gossip about composers and singers and different things. And I'm like, how do I write about this? Because it's not really a traditionally accepted historical source. They're just sort of talking, and sharing stories, and many of them are not true. And so, yeah, I got very into reading about how different fields approach gossip and anecdote and speculation and all of these sort of unreliable sources. And that got me thinking about what to do after grad school and after turning the dissertation into a book. And I've always had an interest in 18th century music, and my master's thesis was on one of Salieri's operas. And I was like, okay, great. Like, I'm going to start this new project on Salieri and the history of gossip in composer biography. And of course, if you're reading anything about sort of Mozart biographical history, Salieri plays a big role, but also Constanze plays a big role, specifically in the spread of a lot of stories and rumors and accounts of Mozart's life, because she outlived him for so many decades, as we'll talk about. And she was really involved in this industry that was kind of taking off at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century in public interest in stories about famous musicians. So yeah, I got really sort of interested in how she fit into all of that, all of the things I was reading about where some of these stories came from. And I also was really interested in the fact that many of the people who were publishing and sharing these anecdotes were men who were friends of various composers or former students who were sort of decades after the fact saying, oh, I knew so-and-so, I knew Beethoven, or I knew Schubert, or different 19th century folks. And Constanze is a really interesting case because there is this sense of sort of preserving her husband's legacy. And I think that's part of why she's had the sort of complicated posthumous reputation that she's had, because, she knew Mozart as sort of a, messy individual that she married and, had a relationship with in her 20s. And then after his death, saw him become this very mythologized figure. And that had to be weird. Like, I think about that a lot. A lot of these rumors and stories that we hear, particularly about Mozart, but sometimes about other composers of this time period as well, a lot of them are emerging when people who knew these guys are still alive and still active, and in some cases taking part in, sharing their stories. And so, yeah, I think it's fair to be very skeptical of a lot of the things Constanze says when she's interviewed, in the 1820s about Mozart, because it's been a few decades and there's been various accumulated myths and stories and rumors and everything. But yeah, I also think it's interesting to think about, like, where is her agency in this process? And like, how does she go from becoming this widow who's sharing these stories to the subject of things like Amadeus and various other fictions where sort of her character is also kind of heavily dramatized and fictionalized and reinterpreted over the decades.
Yeah, I was going to mention Amadeus.
Yes.
As part of this podcast, I do a series on Patreon where we watch costume dramas and talk about them. And Amadeus is one of the first films we did. So my knowledge of the life of Mozart, Salieri, and Constanze comes entirely from that movie. I've never read up on any of them. So I'm just kind of like, that was the story.
Yeah,
that's what it was like.
It's a fascinating thing that definitely sort of fits into this larger trajectory of how all of their stories have been told.
Well, and Amadeus, it's a movie from, I forget exactly, but it's like the early 80s. So it's an older movie at this point, but I think it really set the scene for people like myself, just casual people who are into it. They're like, okay, now I know the story of Mozart, Salieri, and Constanze because I watched that movie. Like, it's sort of set an understanding for, I think, a generation of people being like, okay, that's what it was.
I think Seth Meyers has a recurring joke on, is it Late Night, where he's like, it comes up now and then where it's like, oh, you have a substitute teacher in high school. Guess we're going to watch Amadeus. And
yeah.
Yeah. And I just saw Sky TV is making a miniseries based on Amadeus, like this year.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
For the 40th anniversary of the film. They're doing a limited series, and they're very much advertising it as sort of being about Mozart and Salieri and Constanze. And so I'm very interested how it will sort of expand upon things in the film and the play.
Yeah. Well, and also just coming to it, because if it's based on Amadeus, listeners, is a play. It was a play that was made into a movie that reimagines the life of Mozart and his rivalry with Salieri, who is another composer. and making it a dramatic story. Like, I'm sure making stuff up, taking some of the stuff you're talking about, the gossip and the legends, and really playing them as if they're true. Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see a new adaptation. If it's an adaptation of that same play, it's going to hit the same story beats, I would imagine.
Yeah, I'm very curious what they'll do. And yeah, it's just to sort of build on your explanation there. It's a fascinating play, and in this larger project that's mostly about Salieri, I've sort of been in denial whenever I apply for grants and things about like, no, there's way more to it than just Amadeus. There's this whole history of fictions and anecdotes and gossip and things. But I am like, there will be a chapter in the book I'm working on about Peter Schaffer, the playwright who wrote Amadeus and adapted it for the film. And he wrote a number of essays and interviews and things about his research process and sort of the process of writing historical fiction, and sort of what do you play up for dramatic effect, and how do you change things. And I think it's because it's had this long history as a play and a film, and now this new adaptation, and it still frequently gets performed in various theaters. I just saw it in Salzburg back in January.
In Salzburg, yeah.
In Salzburg, yeah. Because it sort of has this staying power, I think there's the risk, as you mentioned, that people sort of watch it and are like, oh yeah, that's how things were in the 1780s. But there's also the opportunity to think about like, how does historical fiction work, and how do these rumors work in different contexts?
Well, and this is part of what's really interesting to me about the way that you've described your research and everything, because a lot of, like, especially this season where I'm looking at some like Native American stories and things like that, like oral history, or like the oral history of like enslaved people and how their families through oral storytelling would continue on, and also how like the great men of history, quote unquote, can be very careful about writing their legacies and not writing down some other things. So you have to rely on things like gossip when you're looking at, for instance, like Thomas Jefferson's relationship with Sally Hemings.
Oh yeah,
like he
absolutely.
never wrote about that, but there was so many gossip. So like looking at like some gossip stuff is made up, but also sometimes that's a way to get some information, some truth that is not being recorded in other ways. So that's such an interesting thing.
Yeah, and I think Constanze sort of falls kind of in between those kind of things, because on the one hand, she is the one sort of protecting the legacy and deciding what to share and what not to share. And there are Mozart's letters, there are some that she chooses not to have published. There are others that she kind of surprisingly does. But she also like was there and is clearly aware of, public interest in sort of anecdotal stories that are impossible to back up, about, how Mozart wrote specific operas and things. Like, he didn't write about some of that. And so she's saying like, oh yeah, we were sitting at home drinking punch and he was writing the overture to Don Giovanni or something. And it's like, well, that's impossible to verify. I don't know if that happened.
No, exactly. And that's what I've been really, just especially this season, some of the stories that I was just giving as examples, like I'm really coming to rely on oral storytelling and gossip and things like that where it's like, well, a historian can't verify this, but it's like, well, that doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Right.
That doesn't mean it's not true. So just kind of like giving credence to and respecting sometimes somebody's personal anecdote or the oral storytelling, because why not? It's like either that's true or we don't know what happened. So let's go with this suggestion of what happened.
Yeah. Well, and all of these anecdotes, the ones coming from Constanze and about her and about other people, like this whole economy of sort of publishing anecdotes in the early 19th century, in sort of music publications, newspapers and magazines and things, like, because there's this focus on publishing, what we get now is the written down version of what was originally an oral story. And sometimes maybe the written down version that has passed through several hands, and, perhaps some editor, or someone thinks like, oh, but this reminds me of this other thing that would make a better story. And so it's interesting because it clearly comes from kind of an oral tradition of telling stories and anecdotes and things. but it's also mediated by the press, and it's mediated by what you're allowed to publish in different cities and different things, and how news circulates. Yeah, I gave a talk yesterday here at Concordia about this British newspaper that clearly had heard that Salieri had died. He hadn't. This was in 1823, so this was 2 years before his death. But they ran an obituary. And then in the next issue, their correspondent from Vienna clearly wrote to them and was like, actually, he's still alive. He's been hospitalized. This is what's going on. So yeah, you have these cases, in the press, which is publishing these anecdotes where, news travels slowly. And sometimes there's a lot of speculation about when someone at one of these newspapers or magazines hears a story that seems authoritative. They hear it from some source that they trust, but they assume like, oh, well, this had to be months ago, or weeks ago, depending on, how fast someone gets across Europe. And by the time we're publishing it, this must have happened. And so sometimes you do get these kind of wild stories about concerts and about, people traveling and people being, run out of town and different things because there's these sorts of speculation based on available information.
If I can just really dive into the history nerd angle with you and the listeners, you know what? Fast forward if you want. So I've been watching I, Claudius, the miniseries about ancient Rome and stuff. And so as I've been watching it, I've been sort of looking up well, what were, how do we know the things? And so it's very much so it's based on this novel by Robert Graves from the 1930s, but he was pulling directly from the things that people wrote maybe a generation after the Julio-Claudians were actually around, which were people who hated the Julio-Claudians, trying to make them sound as decadent and sexually deviant as possible. And Robert Graves was like, okay, I'm going to just take that as fact, for his novel. And then, but so things facts about, Caligula or something these are such famous people oh, this is what he was like. And here's how all these people poisoned all these people. Where it's well, actually, we're well, these are the sources. It's no, but they're just you're saying, those are gossip. Those are biased. And that was something I remember. I did a history undergraduate degree, and in one of the very first classes, they were saying oh, all history has got some bias, whoever's writing it. And I was what? It's not objective. So just the fact, even some, well-known stories or Cleopatra or something, it's the things that were written that people accept as fact are those were anecdotes. Those were gossip as well. But because we don't have anything else from that long ago, we accept them as facts. So what you're saying about the way that these anecdotes are written down, it feels to me the closer we get to contemporary or to modern times, the more people are oh, well, we have to be more doubtful. Is this true? But when you go back to the classic world, it's it's true. Sure, it's true. It's really old. We believe it.
Yeah, it's been repeated enough times that it sort of takes on a kind of authority.
So that's one of the things when you first got in touch with me and I saw that you were doing this history of gossip and stuff, I was this is fascinating. What an interesting thing. Because even you see that today in, blind items about celebrities and stuff, which some people take as truth. And some of them are true and some of them aren't true. It's interesting when you see how people present themselves versus what the rumors are. And the truth is somewhere in the middle. Constanze.
Yes, we should actually talk about Constanze.
We should talk about Constanze. But, we talked a lot about, she married, spoiler, she married Mozart, and then she was responsible for sort of maintaining his legacy and because she outlived him by quite a while. But who was she? Where was she born? What was her family like? What's the situation?
Yeah, so she's born in Zell in 1762.
And that is in what is now Germany?
Yeah.
Or Austria? Yeah.
I believe Germany. Geography, not my strong suit.
No, but also it's yes. Back then, it wasn't Germany.
Right,
back
yes.
Then,
and well, the thing is back then, and this is something that comes up a lot in the literature on Salieri, if you speak German, you're living in sort of areas controlled by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you're just referred to as German. In the second half of the 18th century. And so there's a lot of things I've been reading lately where people are talking about, oh yes, our great German composers. And then I'm looking and I'm like, well, they were born in Italy and they were born in, what's now Czechia and different things. And it's like, oh, but they were working in Vienna in German. So they're German.
Okay.
But anyway, so she's born in the early 1760s, in 1762. And from a musical family. Her father was a singer and a copyist. And actually, in a bit later on, spoiler, Mozart is interested in one of her older sisters first. And so when Mozart first meets all of the Webers, her family, her maiden name is Weber, he writes to his father, Leopold, that the Weber family, they kind of remind him of his own family, that you've got this musical father and these siblings who are, professional musicians. And the family, they're in Zell. Some of the things I read talk about how her father, Fridolin Weber, there was some kind of scandal or something. They leave Zell and go to Mannheim. And there were 6 kids total in the family, 4 daughters and 2 sons. The sons both died in infancy. All of the sisters lived quite long lives. And in Mannheim, Fridolin gets a job at the court as a singer and a copyist, someone who makes the parts for the musicians to play. And her 2 oldest sisters, Josefa and Aloysia, become professional singers. And Aloysia in particular is involved in kind of Italian language opera, which was big. And then that's sort of her professional career, is how the Webers first come into contact with Mozart.
So like he got this job at court. Great. That's a job. He's being paid money. But like how, for a musician, just from the movie Amadeus, I know that it can be, you're working job to job often when you're a musician in this era, unless you're like under the patronage of one of the monarchs or that sort of thing. So they have all these, these 4 daughters you have to raise. Is that part of why they start being musicians as well, just to make more money just for the family? Like, is it sort of how poor are they, I guess is my question.
They're not poor. And I think that's something important to stress actually about the Webers, but about the Mozarts as well. Because if you watch the movie or the play Amadeus, towards the end of Mozart's life, they're depicted as in a kind of extreme poverty. The thing is, in this time, I shouldn't phrase it as only in this time and place, but like because of how credit works and because of how like payment works, if you're involved with a theater, if you're paid out of the ticket sales or whatever, you can accrue quite a lot of debt and be like bourgeois or like middle class, like class wise, and still be sort of getting by on credit. And, this is not, this is a time before debit cards. This is a time where a lot of money moves around before it actually gets to your hand. And so there are letters that Mozart famously writes, asking some of his fellow Masons for money. And if you read them in isolation, it sounds like, they're in extreme poverty and he's asking for, these huge sums of money. And it's like, well, yeah, because they have debts and they have costs associated with Wolfgang and Constanze's health and the children's health and different things. But the expectation is like, okay, he's working on an opera. And when he gets, the opera takes off, then he'll be able to pay everyone back and it's fine. And that's just sort of how being in the theater worked. There are similar issues earlier in the 18th century with Georg Friedrich Handel in London, where on paper, his banking records survive. So on paper, there are times where it looks like he doesn't have a lot of money, but he's living in a very fancy, like a very nice house and all of these things. And it's because when the ticket sales for the theater come in, then, everybody gets paid and everything's fine and he has cash again. And so I think there's a couple of things going on with the Webers in this period. That Fridolin does have a fairly stable job as a singer at court and as a copyist. I mean, you don't make loads of money as a copyist, surely not as much as the composers and performers and things, but you'll always have work. Like everything needs to be written out by hand. But I do suspect that part of the reason there was this interest in sort of encouraging the children to train in music and become singers, part of it is definitely financial. Part of it is also in part because of people like the Mozarts in the sort of early, 1760s into the 1770s. You have this awareness of these sort of extraordinary child musicians and this idea that you can, the whole family can go on tour and perform and, get attention and perhaps some money and connections and things. And Josefa and Aloysia, they don't seem to have been kind of child prodigies to the extent that Wolfgang and Nannerl and Mozart were, but they were clearly musically gifted from a young age. They, singers, opera singers, then and now often sort of begin their training and their career and their studying quite young. So that's a great question about sort of the finances. And of course, there would also be the awareness with 4 daughters in this period that you would be thinking about, they're going to have to get married and there's going to need to be some kind of arrangements made for that.
But they're not singing, they're not like street singers,
No,
they're not just like
no.
day to day. Like the whole, well, like you said, like the father has this stable job and then they're there. And once you're in that world, I would presume you would be interacting with maybe the sorts of people who would want to marry a woman who's a talented singer and who's maybe like a more rich type person, perhaps.
Not necessarily a wealthy person, but probably someone else in the arts. So looking at the Webers, I am blanking on what Sophie, the youngest, what her husband did, but Josefa eventually marries an actor. Aloysia, spoiler alert, does not marry Mozart and marries a painter, and he might act also.
I'm just looking up Sophie's husband was a composer, tenor, and choir master.
Okay, yeah. So they all married artists. In that, I often say when people ask, how much of how Mozart and Constanze are depicted in Amadeus is true, I often say well, there's a lot of fiction, but you also have to remember these are theater people. Think of the sort of, your friend in a band or the, theater in your area, all of that kind of theater person, drama and whatnot. That was happening then too, to some extent.
Yeah.
Weird, messy relationships and breakups and things. That is not new.
Oh, no, exactly. So they meet Mozart in the context of being musicians.
Yes.
He comes because he's like, oh, a family band, like my family. I'm just going to go hang. He came to visit them and he came to stay with them. Is that right? He was boarding with them or something?
Yeah. So it's sort of the chronology of when he's living with them and when he's not is sometimes a bit hard to track because he originally meets them in Mannheim in 1777, and he comes to Mannheim. So Mannheim had this very rich court that supported a quite famous orchestra and a theater. And so Mozart in the 1770s, he is He is a young man. He is no longer sort of touring as a child prodigy with his sister. And he's looking for a job. And he does not especially want to stay in his hometown and work for the Prince Archbishop there. And so he's looking for places where he can get a stable job as a composer. So yeah, there's this sense that like, great, there's this singer he's acquainted with that he's kind of into. There's this court, maybe he can get a job as a composer there. And so yeah, he's kind of close with the family then for a variety of reasons, some of which having to do with sort of musical politics, some of which having to do with Leopold, Mozart's father, is like not too keen on the prospect of his son kind of rushing into marriage with the singer.
Which is Constanze's older sister, again, just to clarify.
Yes.
She's like this 15-year-old, also singer, but Mozart is focusing on her older sister.
Yes. Yeah. No, I should clarify who Mozart is into at any given time. But yeah, so Mozart and his mother, who's traveling with him, they go on to Paris to try and kind of work some connections there. And the Webers wind up a couple of years later moving to Vienna. And part of that is for Aloysia and Josefa's careers. Part of that is Fridolin dies. And so the family now is very dependent on the daughter's singing careers. And so, Vienna is the place where there are these, a number of theaters and opera companies and various things. And so they're in Vienna. And then that's when Mozart ends up boarding with them, because he eventually gets to Vienna. And yeah, again, recurring theme, looking for a job, looking for professional connections in the industry, and, setting up concert series and trying to make connections at the theater and sort of all of the things you do when you're new to a city and trying to get set up. It's also during this time that Aloysia has gotten married to Josef Lange. Mozart is sometimes boarding with the Webers, sometimes not, and he starts to express interest in Constanze,
who is now like 19 years old.
Yeah, she is 19. He is, in his 20s, early 20s.
Yeah.
For once, I made a very detailed Constanze timeline, and all of my pre-existing Mozart knowledge is like, right.
I think he's like 28 or so.
Yes.
Because he was 24 when she was 15, and now she's 19, so he's like late 20s. And he starts courting her, but like he's the boarder of the family, and that's a bit kind of like, that's not cool. That's a bit unseemly.
Yeah, it's a bit sort of, marrying your landlady's daughter. And all of this, we talked quite a bit at the beginning about all of the place of gossip in how we think about all of these people. And this is where we first start to get kind of inklings in the historical record that there is some gossip circulating. So Leopold Mozart's father back in Salzburg, is clearly starting to hear some things about that his son is having some kind of relationship with this other Weber daughter. And also that, his son went off to Vienna, to the big city, and is, living this life. And it's unclear what happens first, as far as Mozart does send a letter late in 1781 he sort of goes on about a number of things musically and at the theater, and then at the end is sort of like, oh yeah, by the way, I'm going to marry someone, I bet you'll never guess who, like one of the Webers. And he sort of goes through all of the Weber sisters and is sort of mildly dismissive about all of them, and then is like, oh, but yes, I'll marry Constanze. At the same time, there clearly is some kind of negative gossip about Constanze's character. And it might just be that she's like living with this guy and they're not married yet. But there's clearly some kind of rumors that are getting back to Salzburg because Mozart sends these letters, praising Constanze's character and she'll be such a good wife. And she makes some bonnets or some kind of hat that she sends as a gift in an L to try and like win her over. It's like,
okay, but it says here, and again, like I have your article about her open, but I also have Wikipedia open, and it says Constanze had permitted another young man to measure her calves in a parlor game.
That did happen, yes. I was going to get to that. Yeah.
Okay. I was just wondering if that was the scandal. Yeah.
Yeah, that is part of it. That seems to have been more of a source of tension between Wolfgang and Constanze.
Okay, this wasn't like the thing that the dad was like, her calves were measured, don't marry her.
I don't know that story in particular got to Leopold. I'm not sure. But that is mentioned in a letter from Wolfgang to Constanze, kind of about like, well, I don't know, like basically, the woman I marry needs to be respectable, which is like, again, all of these people are like going to parties and, the 1780s in Vienna in sort of the artistic scene, like this would not, these sorts of flirtatious party games would not have been unusual at this time.
Well, and I think if you're going to marry anyone from that community, like they're all at these parties. Like if you want a wife who doesn't do this stuff, then like don't marry someone from the artistic community of Vienna in the 1780s. Well,
and this comes up, I don't know if this is in the Wikipedia article, but it's in the letter that Mozart wrote. So at this party, the Baroness Waldstetten, I am pronouncing that wrong, but this noblewoman who was a friend of the Mozart family and with whom he and Constanze for a time both lived. I believe she was the host of the party. She also like took part in the same game and like also had her calves measured by some party guests. And Mozart kind of dismisses this as like, well, she's old and nobody takes that seriously. But so yeah, no, this was the sort of thing that went on at parties.
Just measuring calves, whatever, get your calves out.
Measuring calves, yeah, that's I'm amused by the like specificity of this, like that it wasn't just like, oh, they were, flirting or something or whatever, but it was specifically the calves. And I think it's because you would have to like lift your skirts.
I don't know. I appreciate that detail as a lover of just weird scandal. So the Mozart's dad was like, are you sure you're going to marry her? And he's like, yes. But then he's like, Constanze, can you not have your calves measured, please?
Yeah.
But the courtship continues and they do get married.
Yes, in 1782. And in the year following that, they actually visit Salzburg. So Constanze meets her father-in-law and her sister-in-law. Anna Maria, Mozart's mother, had died during the trip to Paris. So yeah, Constanze meets her surviving in-laws. And it seems to go okay. She sings in a performance of a mass that Mozart writes for her to sing the soprano solo in the C minor mass. So it's an interesting thing thinking about, again, the sort of gossip that develops around Constanze and around the Mozart family as a whole. We don't know, and this is something a lot of Mozart biographers bring up. I'm thinking of the conductor, Jane Glover, has a book called Mozart's Women that's about Nanel and the Webers and various other singers that Mozart worked with and female characters in his opera. When she's talking about Leopold's feelings about Constanze and about the rest of the Weber family, something she really brings up is that like whenever the Mozarts and Leopold are visiting. So when they come to Salzburg, or a couple of years later when he comes to Vienna to visit, we don't have their thoughts from that time, because most of what we know about, in particular, Leopold and Wolfgang's thoughts from this period are letters that they're writing when they're separated. So like when they're actually in the same room, we don't know how they felt about it, you know?
Yeah. So they got married, and this is where, like, again, I have your article is very much kind of like thematic. The Wikipedia article is more sort of like chronological, which is where but it skips right from they got married and then he died, but they're married for 9 years. So what was that? What do you know about that time period?
They're mostly based, their sort of home base is in Vienna, where Mozart is concertizing. He's giving a lot of piano, solo piano concerts. He's writing operas. Most of the operas of his that are still performed today were written for theaters in Vienna. He's attempting to, and to some extent succeeding at getting sort of semi-permanent and then permanent positions at either at court or with a church. The thing is, and I think the reason a lot of narratives kind of skip from their very dramatic, very gossipy courtship to they're married and then Mozart dies, is because the bulk of the anecdotes that sort of develop later, there's a lot of focus on the circumstances of Mozart's death and the fact that Constanze and her younger sister Sophie were present there. And so there's like lengthy accounts that get kind of semi-fictionalized in retellings about that. But like what's actually happening in the 1780s is...
What I'm seeing is she was constantly pregnant for those 9 years.
Yes. Yeah. She had 6 children, of whom 2 survived to adulthood, Karl, Thomas, and Franz Xavier Wolfgang. And yeah, and this is something I think about a lot with her, when we think about her reputation and the fact that for some chunks of time in the late 1780s and early 1790s, sometimes much is made of the fact that she's off at the spa. She's off in Baden taking the waters, as they would have said. And there are some biographers, mostly early 20th century male biographers of Mozart, who make a big deal about like, oh, she had these sort of vague illnesses and she was off at the spa and, you know, she was never sick again during her second marriage. And it's like, well, she was never pregnant again during her second marriage. And she was pregnant 6 times in her 20s. So
in an era where like every time you're pregnant, you're taking your life in your hands because doctors aren't washing their hands and all these things that like,
there's very little sense of like painkillers, which blows my mind. Like when we see these families, you know, where, you know, the wife or if the wife dies and, you know, the father remarries, I'm thinking of like the Bachs, where like Johann Sebastian Bach was married twice and like combined total of 20 kids in that. And like not all of them survived to adulthood. And it wasn't like, because there was such an age difference between sort of the older and the younger, it wasn't like there were 20 kids in the house at the same time. But that is still like, there are a lot of kids being born. Someone is pregnant a lot of the time.
Well, no, and then I would think like in terms of Constanze, what you're saying, like she would take the water, she was having health issues. It's like, yeah, because she was constantly pregnant for 9 years. Many of the children died. She would be dealing with a combination of postpartum and like literal grief constantly. It's like, yeah, good for her. Go take the waters. Like you need to take some time for yourself, please.
Well, and part of this is we have Wolfgang's letters to her when she's in Baden, which are a great source for like what he's doing in Vienna as far as the theater. And there's a lot of kind of mention of various pieces of his that are being performed and musicians he's working with and this sort of thing. But her responses have not survived from this period. We have letters of hers from later in her life when she's dealing with publishers and writing to her sons and various things, but we don't have her letters to Mozart. And I think that's a place where people have been able to read into that what they want. If they want to see her as sort of this either really frivolous or perhaps uncaring spouse that, her husband is writing these great operas and, she's off at the spa, you can read things that way. By the same token, he writes to her like pretty constantly. And so like you can also read that. And I think Rudolf Angermüller, who wrote the version of the Grove encyclopedia article that I expanded upon in my research on Constanze and gossip, like he really reads these as like a sign of how strong their marriage was.
Yeah, it's that they're just like texting you 25 times a day, like to be writing letters all the time. It shows he's thinking about her. He wants her to know what he's up to. Yeah.
Yeah. And he trusts that, like, she gets it. Like, she's also from this musical family. She knows how the opera works. There are stories about other composers. I'm thinking of Joseph Haydn, who was older than Mozart, but a good friend of his. And there are all of these stories about how his wife really didn't care about music at all and wasn't particularly interested in what her husband was writing. And like, clearly, at least from what we can read from Mozart's side of things, he takes it for granted that she cares and she wants to know and she wants to be sort of kept in the loop. And
she gets it. Like, she knows, growing up with her dad and her family, she knows the importance of like, oh, I applied for this job, or I just got this commission and I'm writing this. Like, she would know both the business side of being a musician and also the artistic side. So I think in terms of a marriage where this period of time, we don't know a lot, but I think what you said, that's really interesting. Like, other composers didn't have a partner who was from this world and got it. So like, that was part of what she brought to the table, was that they could be peers in that way. Like, she would understand what he's doing.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that I think comes into play after Mozart's death, is that she is able to leverage a lot of these connections. Like, she is able, she petitions the court for a pension, and she writes to publishers about, publishing selling various scores and things he's written. Eventually, her second husband starts writing a Mozart biography, and she sort of pulls together what papers she has as far as letters and documents and things.
So I have a question. So in his life, Mozart, like now, even people who aren't super knowledgeable about classical music know Mozart. Like, that's the name. It's like, he's such a famous person, but in his time, was he just like one of many composers? Like, it wasn't like, oh my God, it's Mozart. Like, it's Taylor Swift. Like, how famous was he?
I don't know that he was quite Taylor Swift level, but I don't know that any composer then as now, people would go to the opera to see their favorite singer. They would go to see Loisiana or Caterina Cavalieri or different people. Like, but he was famous. I mean, he was known as a child prodigy. His music was well known. He put on various subscription concerts where people would he would organize the concert and then people would buy tickets and things. So he was very, very well known as a composer. Now, there wasn't the kind of view I think a lot of people have of folks like Mozart and Beethoven and that now, classical composers, who are sometimes considered, timeless, geniuses or anything. Like, no, at the time they were working musicians. They were people, and I think that's important to remember, that there a lot of the myth making of sort of like divine inspiration and this sort of stuff that came later.
Yeah.
Some of that came during Constanze's lifetime, for sure. Like, you get some kind of very flowery writings about Mozart's music in the 1820s and 30s. But at the time, there was a sense that, someone like Mozart working in a variety of musical genres and writing some very popular operas and things, like brilliant composer, but not necessarily, transcendent genius, and not necessarily obviously more brilliant than someone like Salieri, for example.
Well, and that's kind of like, just to bring it back to Amadeus again, like what I got from that film is kind of at the time, it's like Salieri they were on par with each other. It's like, oh, I'm going to go see this show. It's by Salieri. I'm going to see this one. It's by Mozart. Like, and now, like, Mozart is like the guy. He's so famous. And Salieri is kind of like, oh, wasn't he a character in Amadeus? Like, his music is not seen as timeless as whatever. But so Mozart, that's just what I kind of wanted to build a picture for myself. So Constanze is just kind of like giving birth, having children, mourning dead babies for 9 years. And Mozart is just like supporting the family, like being a working, medium famous composer guy, basically.
Yeah.
And then he dies of what? Murder by Salieri?
Probably rheumatic fever.
Okay.
Definitely, almost certainly not murder.
Okay.
He had been ill several times as a small child, and it's likely that he basically had some pre-existing conditions, which feels weird to think about now that we've all been thinking about these sorts of things, since 2020 about comorbidities and things. But from what, diagnosing historical figures is always difficult. But from what I've read of some of the kind of medical historical literature, it seems likely that it was a recurrence of something he had previously suffered.
So he fell ill, and he's quite young when he died. I know you have Constanze.
He is almost 36.
So super young. She's slightly younger than that because she's slightly younger than him. 2 surviving children, very young. And you were saying, like, his death, there was lots of people who were there at his death, or we have a lot of records about his death.
We have a lot of stories about his death because a couple things were sort of going on when he fell ill. First of all, he had just written a phenomenally successful German comic opera, The Magic Flute. And so people were talking about that, and, singers and Emanuel Schikaneder, the actor and theater owner, and the person who wrote the libretto, the text for The Magic Flute. We had these people stopping by. One of his sisters-in-law, Josefa, actually premiered the role of the Queen of the Night in The Magic Flute. So that aria, and I am so not going to pretend to be a singer and try and hit that high note, but the very difficult German aria that, like, if you know one part of The Magic Flute, it's like the soprano singing this very kind of angry sounding.
The part where it's like I'm going to sing it very low. It's like
Yes,
and then it goes
exactly.
And it goes like higher and higher.
It just keeps going.
Yeah, that one.
Yeah, that
Thank
was
you.
that was Josefa saying that.
Okay, she had that range. She had that Mariah Carey whistle range.
She could pull that off. And so you had this theatrical success, and you also have something that has made centuries of a really good story, in that Mozart also received an anonymous commission to write a requiem, a mass for the dead.
That's an Amadeus. Yes. Okay. I'm familiar. And now for a quick advertising break.
Desfrute do novo Icon of the Seas da Royal Caribbean agora partindo de Miami. É o ícone das férias repleto de atrações, com o maior parque aquático no mar e espetáculos sensacionais da Broadway. Com destinos incríveis no Caribe, incluindo a premiada ilha particular Perfect Day at Coco Cay, a aventura nunca acaba. Icon of the Seas, as melhores férias em família do mundo. Acesse royalcaribbean.com/BRA. Aplicam-se termos e condições.
Desde 2019, a Toyota vem acelerando o futuro, produzindo no Brasil o primeiro híbrido flex do mundo. De lá pra cá, as coisas mudaram. Muitos entraram na tendência que a gente criou. Mas sabe o que não mudou? A confiança do brasileiro na Toyota, que não veio da noite pro dia. Toyota, no futuro há muito tempo. Paz no trânsito começa por você.
People often look at me with confusion when I ask them what their only one in the room story is. They think it has to be like mine, where I went to a 600-person event and discovered that I was the only Black person there. I know. Horrifying, right? Hi, I'm Laura Cathcart Robbins, and I am the host and creator of the podcast Only One in the Room. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's only one story. This podcast is for anyone who has ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone.
And we're back.
But not from Salieri as depicted.
Salieri, evil in a mask, impersonating his dead father. No, it was.
Yeah, that so did not happen.
Okay, someone else. Okay.
The actual story of the Requiem is really bizarre in that there was this nobleman, Count Walsegg, who his wife had died, and he wanted a Requiem mass to mourn, to commemorate her death. And Walsegg apparently had this reputation of pretending to be a composer, which is bizarre. Apparently he would do this. He would commission works anonymously. And then once they were sent to him, he would tell the musicians who worked for him, oh yeah, I wrote this. And they just kind of played along. And I'm sure this guy's paying the bills. I'm sure they just sort of played along, but everybody knew.
And he wasn't actually. What a grift. Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Well, it gets griftier, and it gets, and it I think we'll speak to Constanze's scheminess score later on, because so Mozart dies in December of 1791, and this presents Constanze with a lot of problems. Her beloved husband is dead, and she has some debts to deal with and 2 young children to take care of.
Sorry, I just want to say, and in general, she's a woman in a world where she can't own money or property, and she can't just be okay, well, I'll support the family as a working person. It's complicated.
Yeah, well, and she, unlike her older sisters, has not had this established career as an opera singer. So it's not like she can say exactly oh, I'll go back to the theater. I'll go, it's a bit more complicated for her. And adding to this complication is the fact that there's this piece, the Requiem, that Mozart has received partial payment for, with the rest of the commission to come once a full score is delivered. And he has died, and it is not complete. And so some of this sort of negotiating may have taken place before his death as he fell ill, but some of it definitely took place after, in that okay, we need to find some other composer or composers who can wrap this stuff up, get it off to this mysterious person who's commissioned it, so that Constanze can get the rest of the commission, to get the family finances in more order. And so she actually works with a couple of Mozart's colleagues, students, other composers, and one of them in particular, Franz Süssmayr, who's often referred to as Mozart's student, although I don't know. Unlike people like Haydn and Salieri, Mozart was not extremely well known as a composition teacher. He had keyboard students that he taught piano to. In any case, Süssmayr was a composer who was sort of working with Mozart on the Requiem, and was sort of a kind of family friend or family acquaintance. Constanze knew him, and supposedly part of why she was working with him to finish the Requiem is he could imitate Mozart's signature. And so there's a signature by Süssmayr that is, Wolfgang Mozart, January 1792. And like all of this clearly is this polite fiction to like...
Because Mozart died in December 1791. Yeah.
Yes. And everyone knew this. Like, it's not like it was a secret. They weren't, they weren't Weekend at Bernie's seeing Mozart around. Like, he had died. And people, again, he was a well-known composer. So people knew, Wolfgang knew he had died. But there was this sort of like, kind of a polite fiction around getting this in, getting this done. And this leads to some of the kind of the question of unreliability in some of Constanze's later accounts, because there are times when she says, oh yes, Mozart finished the Requiem. And it's like, well, no, he didn't. And everyone knew he didn't. And you knew he didn't because you were there.
Right. But that's where, like, you look at what somebody wrote and you're like, well, this is written, but just because someone wrote something doesn't mean it's true or that it happened. But,
right.
Yeah.
And also, like, for what purpose are some of these stories being written? And sort of like, is this something she's telling people in 1792 or 1795 when this is still like very recent in time? Or is it 1827 and she's sort of building a much more kind of grand biographical narrative?
Well, and also just kind of like at that point, it's like, this is accepted that he finished this. So like, let's just correct so she's in this situation, like, first of all, like, let's finish this Requiem, get this money. But then what are the other business sorts of decisions that she turned to? Because this is where I think during her time married to Mozart, she was constantly pregnant, dealing with various health things. He's died and she just switches gears to be like, I'm going to provide for my family by like business decisions. So what does that look like?
So throughout the 1790s, kind of alongside and after, getting the Requiem done, you have a variety of kind of publication decisions. So negotiating with some very, still quite well-known publishers like Breitkopf and Hartel, which is still around today, selling music, selling manuscripts for publication. And this is really in kind of the early days of what we might consider music copyright. So this kind of period in the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century in Europe. And it's different in different countries. And Napoleon sort of makes everything more complicated because the sort of copyright laws that develop in the Napoleonic Empire, as it were quite different from elsewhere in Europe. But you start to have the idea that the author of a musical work, the composer, and in this case, the composer's family, has something like what we might consider moral rights to the work.
So they should be paid when this is performed, they should get compensated?
When this is performed or published. And for most of kind of the history of European art music, notated, written music, because obviously we do also have oral, improvised, and folk traditions that aren't written down in this period. But for much of the history of Western art music, we have music that's written for a particular event, for a feast day or for an opera commission. You're writing for a particular theater and particular singers. And there's often, with some significant exceptions, there's often not necessarily the assumption that, in a decade's time, and certainly not, 200 years later, that people will still want to, buy this and listen to this and, play it at home. And what Constanze and plenty of other composers and publishers and their families are really kind of negotiating in the 1790s is this publishing industry, that there is an interest in Mozart's music kind of generally, but specifically that, he wrote, chamber music. And if you and your family play string instruments, you can play this stuff at home. And Constanze is really leveraging her husband's fame and reputation and the professional connections that both of them had in this world to say, like, this music is clearly worth something, and I would like to be paid for it, please.
Yeah. Well, no, and I love that. Well, it's kind of this time where you were saying sort of like copyright is sort of like in flux and like, what does it mean? But she's just like, how am I going to make money? It's not like, oh, I'm going to start, I don't know, performing myself or doing more music myself. She's like, no, like Mozart left this legacy and I'm going to find a way to turn that into like a family business.
She does also perform herself. So she and Aloysia go on a couple of concert tours in sort of the middle of the 1790s, sometimes performing in full operas, sometimes giving concerts. And so there is this sense of sort of like, what can she leverage as a widow and as a quite young widow with musical training and connections to support the family. She also, her writings on her relationship with her sons are quite interesting, and I think speak to how she's thinking about like their education, because they are young. In 1791, Carl Thomas is 6 or 7, and Franz Xavier Wolfgang is like, I want to say like 4 months old, like under a year old.
And so she's like, we're going to like next generation musical family, like let's get these guys trained in music as well, or just kind of like broad general education?
She sort of goes back and forth on it. So there are times when she's kind of very invested in sort of getting them out there, possibly performing or different things. But she's also very aware that, like, in part because Wolfgang was so famous, so well known, and has this reputation, like she seems to have been aware that there would be some kind of pressure placed on the next generation.
Like, are they going to be child prodigies too? Like,
yeah. Well, and there's this fascinating thing that happens. So Carl Thomas had some early training in music and seems to have been a very keen pianist. But at some point she sort of decides, like, no, you should go into the civil service. Basically, you should, he winds up sort of becoming a kind of accountant and like a translator of government documents for the Habsburgs in Italy. So he as an adult, he's off in Milan being an accountant.
More stable career.
Yeah. I think of that, sort of the flip side of running away to join the circus is if your parents are artists, you want the stable job. But the younger son, Franz Xavier Wolfgang, seemed to have developed some level of musical talent quite early. And at some point, Constanze decides, like, yes, this is the one who will be a musician. And he studies with some big names in Vienna, Albrechtsberger, who also taught Beethoven for a time, and Salieri, interestingly enough. And Salieri wrote him what I have described to friends as the most optimistic letter of recommendation in music history, where he was applying for a job, and Salieri wrote this letter basically saying, yes, he studied with me, and I predict that one day he will become, the equal of his celebrated father or something. And it's like, oh dear, you can't live up to that kind of pressure. But
if he works hard, maybe he will become.
Yeah, and he worked as a composer and teacher in various cities in sort of what is now Ukraine and Lithuania. The ways in which kind of thinking about like positioning Franz Xavier Wolfgang as a composer and kind of connecting him to people like Salieri and people like Joseph Haydn. Like there's a very famous concert of Haydn's music where Franz Xavier's, he's like a little kid. I don't think he's a teenager yet at that point, but like a piano concerto by him is performed. And so yeah, the children's education is sort of important kind of as a parent, but it's also part of this, like, how do you negotiate the family reputation and stability and legacy?
Well, and part of what I'm curious to know your thoughts about her efforts to have a biography of Mozart completed. And if that's partially, and there doesn't need to be just one reason. I'm sure part of it is just like she wants him to be known, but also the more, I would guess, the more he's known, the more valuable the publishing, like his music might be played more often. She wants to make him more famous. So to kind of make what she has, her business, the like Mozart legacy, like the more he's better known, the more she can make money by like having her son do concerts and like selling his music. Is that part of why you would imagine she?
I think so. And I think it's also realizing that as we get kind of more into the 19th century here, so just to situate us time-wise in Constanze's life, she meets Georg Nikolaus Nissen, the man who will become her second husband, in the late 1790s, around 1797. They're eventually married.
Sorry, I want to point out he was initially one of her money-making ventures was she took in tenants. Yeah. So he was a tenant. Yeah. So again, this is her game plan. It's just like seduce a person who is a tenant in my home. It's worked for her twice.
I don't know. I mean, there was a good long time between like when they met and when they got married. So I don't know the level of seduction game.
For sure. For sure. I'm being facetious, but I just think she's like, this is my strategy. This is how I know to find a husband. And it's based on when someone's a tenant in my home, I get to know them really well. And then that's how I can.
I mean, if you're also thinking about like, opportunities that men and women have to socialize.
To get to know each other. Yeah,
absolutely. And Nissen was a diplomat from Copenhagen and was also clearly a very keen fan of music. I don't know that he was a musician himself, but he started writing a biography of Mozart. And a lot of biographers get kind of weird about this, that like, oh, did she marry him and then make him write this biography? Or like speculating about like, did he marry her because she was Mozart's widow? And I don't know. I don't know that we know these things. At least they haven't come up in the family letters I've read. But it is interesting thinking about, again, like we were saying, the sort of resources available to the widow, the wife and then the widow of a great man is sort of like, okay, it's the early 19th century and there's this interest in Mozart's music, but there's also this increasing interest in biography and biographies of all sorts of people, like not just, royalty or saints or these sorts of things, but like biographies of famous musicians and this increasing curiosity about, well, I really like this opera or this symphony or whatever, and how was it written? And, what was the first performance like? And who was there? And, what other famous people were involved? And so there are a number of biographies and biographical articles and anecdotes that get published in the early 19th century. So all sorts of things, and some of which, thinking about Mozart, some of which Constanze is sort of directly contributing to, where she's telling anecdotes to people who edit or publish music, newspapers and journals who are publishing them. In some cases, she seems to be sort of selling her story in some way to different publications. But you also get people appealing to her, and to some extent Nanelle and the various other sisters-in-law as authority figures about Mozart's life. So you'll get people publishing a story and sort of like, well, I know I can vouch for this because I heard it from Mozart's widow, or I heard it from, Josefa Weber or Nanelle, and different people. And so, in this case, it really does seem to be that this group of women who may not always have gotten along as people, and may have in some cases, felt various things about one another's relationships and sort of connections to the family, become the keeper of this kind of legacy and are seen as having some sort of authority or approval over like what is Mozart's story.
And through all of these business things she's doing, does she pay off the debt and, make a nice life for herself?
Yeah. She gets into she pays off the debt. She gets into a really, really secure financial situation. She's in Copenhagen for a while with Nissen. She travels to Italy to visit Carl. She winds up eventually, funnily enough, or perhaps not surprising at all, given her kind of late in life career, she winds up in Salzburg. And she winds up living first with Nissen and for a time the children, and later with some of her sisters. And people come and visit her and ask about Mozart's life. There was this couple, they were British music publishers and journalists and Novellos, Vincent and Mary Novello. And they, in the 1820s, yes, I'm just checking my timeline that I've got the right year. They were planning on writing their own sort of English language Mozart biography. And so they came to Salzburg to interview her and several other people. They didn't wind up writing the biography, and sort of their research notes and basically their interview notes were eventually published much later in the 20th century. But they're a really interesting source because you get the sense of these people who are sort of both in awe of the sort of Mozart mythology as it's emerging. But they're also like, they're realize kind of that they're talking to, by now, much older women about these, people and events, decades ago in their lives.
Well, and that's interesting to me too, just to think about how Constanze, like, she lives much more of her life is not with Mozart than was with Mozart. So by the time when she's been thinking about this and helping write these biographies and stuff, it's just like the way that anyone's memory can change and shift. And when you're looking back, you can apply importance to moments that at the time didn't feel important. And when you don't have like, old Facebook statuses or like old pictures or anything, like it's just your memory or letters and things. So how her story might have changed and kind of solidified when she got like sort of a professional job of retelling his story.
So there's, just to give an example of that, there's a story she tells in Novellos about Mozart and Salieri, where she says that, the sort of rivalry between them was because Salieri was asked to write this opera with Lorenzo da Ponte, this great poet that Mozart's most famous Italian operas were written with. And so Salieri was asked to write this opera, and he wrote a couple things for it and really couldn't make it work, and so passed on the text. And Mozart wrote took it up and wrote Così fan tutte. So one of the three operas he wrote with De Ponte. And it's an interesting anecdote because there really isn't evidence for any kind of personal conflict between Mozart and Salieri. Like they were working in the same industry, writing for some of the same theaters and singers, and both working in Italian language comic opera in Vienna. And for, I think, a long time, this story was sort of downplayed or critiqued in Mozart biography, not so much because of the claim of rivalry, because that kind of has its own history as gossip, but sort of, how would, Constanze is commenting on this, detail of, kind of theatrical politics, and how would she know? And, did Salieri really start writing it and then give up and all of this? Well, in the 90s, there's a Salieri scholar named John Rice who found Salieri's sketches for a couple of numbers for the story that would later become Mozart's Così fan tutte. So Constanze may or may not be a reliable source on how Mozart felt about, his professional colleagues. Yeah, you have a bad day at work and you vent about people. It doesn't mean you're enemies for all time. But it is interesting that this little story about, who's going to write this opera, that there does seem to be some documentation that okay, Salieri was going to write it and he, gave up on it or was busy with other things or whatever. And okay, now Mozart writes it.
I love the way that you describe that. It's just people sort of discounted the story and then it's oh, surprise. Actually, Salieri did start writing it.
Yeah. And I do want to stress there, just because I know there's all this kind of myth making about Mozart and Salieri, totally separate from Constanze, but just stress that that's also how a lot of opera in the 1780s worked. Was poets and composers would get commissions to write a particular piece for a particular kind of group of singers for the next season or whatever. And sometimes things wouldn't work out and would kind of fall apart. And sometimes works that people had written earlier would sort of be reworked into new productions in different cities or in a different language, or these things that I think a lot of people today think of as sort of monumental, this is what the Magic Flute is, or this is what Marriage of Figaro is, to think of another Mozart opera. At the time, these works were very malleable, and depending on who was around, there are some famous cases of 18th century singers kind of demanding, regardless of the rest of the opera, well, I want this kind of aria because I want to show off I can sing this. Or there's a case, it's a bit earlier than Mozart, but there's a case, I think in London in the 1730s, of a famous singer who, whenever he entered a scene, he had to be on horseback, and and it did not matter if it did not make sense for the plot of the opera for the singer to enter on a horse. But so these things were very flexible, and there was a lot of understanding in the theater that you go with what worked.
So Constanze herself, so she's in Salzburg, later in life living with some of her sisters, and then she's 80 when she dies.
80 when she dies.
Yeah. So, and she spent most of her life just working on kind of the Mozart legacy and making a business of that, and very successfully, like you said, living financially comfortably.
Yeah.
And then, well, I think I want to move on to the scandaliciousness scale.
Yes.
But that's going to open up some other avenues of discussion of things that I'd like to ask you about. But so the first category in the scale, and these are all 0 to 10 categories. The first one is scandaliciousness. How scandalous was she seen by the society in which she lived? And I feel like there would be a different number for pre-marriage versus post-marriage.
Yeah. I've been thinking about this. This was actually the hardest number for me to come up with because I'm like, well, I know how she's thought of later in some of the literature that might rank her a bit higher. But I also know, listening to other episodes of Vulgar History, like she's definitely not a 1. She is more scandalous. I think I'd say maybe a 4.
Yeah.
Like she's not extraordinarily scandalous, or at least there's not sort of any big documented scandals beyond the, having the party guests measure
Having
her
calf measured
when she's engaged. And some gossip and kind of stray references in letters that, possibly, she and or Mozart may have had some affairs, but like nothing is documented. And a lot of the speculation in that direction really feels to me like something that might be more relevant to the sexism question of.
Well, and you just mentioned, and I want you to explain this. So her reputation, like we've been talking about this woman who, she had fun as a young woman. She married Mozart. He died. She made these sound business decisions. But her legacy, especially in Mozart biography, sort of presents her as this kind of like silly, flighty, airhead, kind of trashy person. That's kind of how she appears in Amadeus, the movie. Although I appreciate her in that movie because she just supports him and loves him. But how has her reputation suffered? Like, how is she written about?
Yeah. So it really fluctuates after her death. And it really depends, I think, when you're talking and where you're talking. So you get depictions of her in German and English language fiction in the 19th century where she's depicted quite positively. Like she's, with Mozart while he's writing these great operas, and she's sort of dealing with his sort of flighty moods as an artist and whatnot in these fictions. And then in the 20th century, I think as you get more kind of, I'll say psychological biographies, but like these biographies of Mozart and of other kind of great men, composers, where you have this idea that sort of they are, the great genius, nobody understands them. They're working alone, even if they have, partners and kids and siblings and all of that, but they're alone, writing their great works that nobody understands. And I think there's a way to read Constanze in those biographies that is quite negative because she wasn't a professional singer and she wasn't, single-handedly keeping the family out of debt all the time and everything, that there's a way to look at Mozart and the singers, the other female musicians that Mozart would have worked with at the opera, not just Aloysia and Josefa, but other people, and think like, well, why didn't Mozart marry, a sort of musician on his level, or why was Constanze sick all the time, which is 100% a case of like biography being written by men. Because I feel like the first time in undergrad, I took a class on women in music, and I wrote a paper for that class about Constanze. And the first time I was reading kind of just the timeline of her life, I'm like, oh, she was pregnant, like all the time in her first marriage. Like there's a really easy answer to like, why was she like sick? And it's like pregnancy in the 18th century. And so you get these biographical narratives about her in the 20th century that are very much either that she wasn't worthy of Mozart or that she didn't know how to manage money. And part of that is kind of cynicism or skepticism about like how good she gets at managing money later on. And it's like, well, but she's on her own. Like, I mean, she eventually remarries, but she's like having to take care of herself and 2 children, like pretty suddenly. So you get this image of her as sort of unworthy. And I think a lot of the sort of frivolous, for lack of a better word, like silly party girl narrative kind of fits into that, is that she's not seen as a kind of great musician. She's blamed in some of this literature for enabling Mozart's kind of own frivolity, which I don't think he needed any help with. And I could easily see, like, if she were, like, let's say she was like just always perfect at managing money, I could see an alternate universe in which she is blamed for being, kind of a shrew or controlling or whatever. Like there are other ways to blame women for their husbands.
Yeah. Well, no, and I think it comes down, we'll get to the sexism score later, but it's just kind of like people wanted, I don't know. For some reason, it seems like they just need Mozart to be this like singular figure. So the fact that he had a wife, you have to set her up as being, he had a wife, but not really. She didn't support him. She didn't help him. And so you just kind of have to look at what we know about Constanze and then just make that seem bad somehow.
Yeah. And I mean, it's totally possible that given what we know of like Mozart's love of like parties and dirty jokes and all kinds of things, that, I bet they had a lot of fun when they were like well and not dealing with the loss of 4 children
constantly.
But like, I don't think it's necessarily the place of musicologists and historians to cast like moral aspersions on like, was Constanze a good wife? Or like was this a happy marriage?
Well, and if part of what you said earlier, it's just like the fact when she was taking the waters, he wrote her lots of letters and we don't have the responses, where it's like, she didn't love him back. Where are her responses? Like just sort of like taking what we see and applying psychological context to them, where it's like, he sent her letters. If she responded or not, like maybe she was there dealing with profound grief and health problems, and maybe she liked getting the letters, and maybe he didn't expect a response. I don't know. Like just to sort of be like, she ignored him or whatever.
I mean, she because he does say like, oh, I've received your letter, or like when she doesn't write, he comments on it. So like, she clearly was responding. And whether it's a matter of he didn't save her letters or she didn't save her, letters. They also moved apartments a lot. And so like, it's totally possible that, there were more and more letters that just got lost or, downsized. I'm in the middle of moving right now myself. And so like right now, my whole life is like stacks of books in my apartment that I need to pack. And it's like, like not everything, makes every move, and not everything is going to survive, a couple hundred years of history.
Yeah. Well, it just seems sort of like I see this nowadays with so many public women figures who are hated no matter what they do. And so it's like they can't, if they change what they do, people are going to hate them for that, where it's like, it's not about what you do. It's just about conceptually people hate the concept of a powerful woman or of a woman. And so they just point out what you do as the things to criticize. Like, for instance, okay, I'll speak for myself on this podcast. There's people who don't like the way that I talk informally on the podcast. But if I spoke, I know that there's people who speak more scripted on podcasts, and they get criticism being like, you're so scripted, where it's just like, oh no, you just hate a woman talking. Like,
yeah. Well, and I think I've thought about this too, because I do think it's worth emphasizing that a lot of the anecdotes that Constanze did tell about Mozart's life, like some of them we know are false or are, as I said, unverifiable. But she was not alone in the landscape of people marketing anecdotes about like their friends or partners, the great composers, to do this. And also, like, I don't think necessarily, definitely not in the 1790s. I don't know about later, but like, she was not necessarily thinking about like, I am personally going to control the Mozart family legacy for all time. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, she was involved with the creation of the Mozarteum organization, or the choir that would eventually become the Mozart research organization in Salzburg. But like, sometimes people talk about her activities in promoting and preserving and controlling the family legacy as though like, oh, she just wanted to make herself look good. And it's like, I don't know that somebody in, let's say, 1795 is thinking about like, oh, I want some academics in, 1970 or 2024 to like think well of me. I don't think that's how anything worked then.
I think
I don't
she's
think
more
that's how
like,
things work now.
I want to pay my rent. I want
Yeah,
to like,
exactly.
yeah, I think it was much more, she was thinking about herself in that time and place. The next category is the scheminess, which you've listened to other episodes and I've explained it to you, but just so the listeners know, like this is a positive thing. A person with a plan, a person who's able to see what life situation they're in and they can pivot and they can find ways to succeed rather than like having life happen to them. And I feel like this would be a high score for her.
Yeah, I'm leaning towards 9 or 10 for this.
Yeah.
Let's err on the side of 10.
Honestly, sure.
Because yeah, between the sort of details of like getting the Requiem done and then also getting Nissen's book out so her second husband also dies before finishing his great work of Mozart biography.
Mm-hmm.
And so like getting that into the world in some form, but also just generally like that here is someone who marries at 19, whose older sisters have these more obvious professional careers and kind of public persona or public space in the public sphere. And she, after this, very tragic life circumstance, finds herself, mobilizing what she has, the tools that she has, the connections that she has, her own family, to make it work and to make it work quite well and to exist in sort of the public space of people who know music and people who are curious about Mozart's music and to exist at a time. I mean, some of this is sort of the luck of when she's around, but that she's in a time when that is possible, when there is publishing, when there is interest in the work of music from, the past few decades, and that she's able to mobilize that, to make use of that.
Yeah, I think like, exactly. Like, I think it is to her benefit that was the time and place where she was alive. But another person in her situation might have wound up penniless. Like if someone didn't put those dots together, if someone didn't leverage these specific connections, like I could see another narrative where she dies, in debtor's prison or something, but she didn't. And it's not like there was the luck of when she lived, but also her own persistence and her intelligence. Yeah.
And I've thought a bit about, oh no, I'll save that for significance.
Well, let's move on to significance.
Yeah. I would say like significance in kind of how we think about composer biography and how we think about Mozart and why we think about Mozart the way we do. I mean, I'd give that a high rating too. I'd say 9.
Yeah.
Because so many of these stories, even the ones that sometimes musicologists are like, oh, I don't know if this is real, but so many of these stories about, Mozart at parties, improvising music, or, staying up late at night, like I said, drinking punch and finishing an opera and all of this, like so many of those images persist. I mean, we see them in things like Amadeus, but we also see them in things of just like how people talk about like classical composers and, what it means what it means to be a famous musician in this time. I was going to say earlier, but I think it fits better here. I've often wondered if Mozart lived longer, or flip side, if Constanze, died younger, would we have the same image of Mozart that we do? If either he had lived long enough to sort of have a role in shaping his own legacy and not have this sort of narrative of tragic, death at a young age and all of that. Or if Constanze, as you say, hadn't been able to mobilize all of this and hadn't been a part of this industry of music biography and musical anecdote and publishing, what would our kind of prevailing image be and our narrative? I think it'd be quite different.
I think so too. And I mean, again, like Mozart is such a, like, even, I don't know when I first heard of Mozart, but like, I think I just knew, oh, that's a famous composer. That's just, you just like, there's that thing where it's like baby Mozart, like play Mozart music to your like unborn children and stuff. Like he is the guy, where it's just like Mozart, he's the guy. Like kind of like Shakespeare is the guy for like plays. Mozart is the guy for music. And that's largely, as you've been explaining so eloquently, like because of, he died young, but also Constanze's nonstop work. And so it's interesting, like her significance is that she solidified that legacy for him, like not for herself.
Yes. Yeah. And how much of the way that legacy was then taken up winds up, in some cases, making her look bad or casting aspersions upon like, well, why would she do this? It's like,
so then the final category on the scale is the sexism bonus. How much was her life affected? I mean, and in her case, I guess it's also kind of her legacy by living in this patriarchal society and sexism in her life. Just what I'm thinking based on like having read your essay and just talking to you now, like I feel, if she hadn't been in a place where she was expected to just constantly have children for 9 years, maybe her own musical career could have been more than it was if she wasn't busy doing that. But also at the same point, I don't want to take away like that was in some ways her choice to do that. Like she did I don't know. So I don't know.
Yeah, I feel like I wrote down 5 because I feel like the amount of sexism she experienced in her life was sort of like baseline, like being a married woman in Vienna in the 1780s.
Exactly, yeah.
But I think the place of sexism kind of in her posthumous legacy is important to unpack and to question. There's a really great, I'm looking at it right now. There's a book by H.C. Robbins Landon, who was a biographer of Mozart and Haydn in the 1980s and 90s. And he wrote a book called 1791, Mozart's Last Year, where most of it is going like month by month through 1791, kind of explaining, what documentary sources do we have for different performances and things. But there are also chapters, debunking some conspiracy theories about Mozart's death. And there's a chapter called Constanze, A Vindication, where he basically goes through a number, like what sources we have about Constanze from her lifetime, both during Mozart's life and after, but also goes through a number of kind of pretty formative 20th century Mozart biographies and talks about how they depict Constanze and sort of like, are these depictions like, are there citations for, someone claiming, she had a bunch of affairs, or someone claiming, she was faking an illness, or like all of these things that people say. And what he really wants to draw attention to is like, a lot of this stuff is all accumulated myth making about what we think, as you said, what we think a great man should be like, and what we think, the person he has relationships with should be like. And a lot of it isn't necessarily in the sources, and doesn't necessarily reflect how people would have thought about marriage and love and partnership in the 18th century. Like a lot of this stuff does seem to come from more kind of 20th century psychological or what do you call it, psychoanalytical kind of approaches to talking about, artists.
That's really, it's such an interesting, I don't know if I've had anyone on the podcast where that was specifically the narrative in terms of sexism. But yeah, I think in her life, she was like, I agree with the 5. I think just kind of like standard issue living under the patriarchy. I don't think it especially negatively affected her in her lifetime any more than any other woman. But then she has had this sort of weird afterlife of just being this kind of
Yes.
like trashed woman, where it's just like to put her down to elevate Mozart is so weird.
It's interesting because we've both sort of alluded multiple times to kind of the impact that the film version of Amadeus has had in how we think about sort of all of these people, all of these characters in the 1780s and 90s. And one of the parts of Amadeus that is fictional, but I find really fascinating, is there's a bit early on when Mozart and Constanze are arguing about a job that Mozart is applying for or wants, and is asked to submit pieces for consideration, and he doesn't want to because he just thinks like he's great and they should pick him. He shouldn't have to apply. And Constanze says something like, well, I know how music works in this city. Like and that scene and then that situation is a heavily fictionalized take on what actually happened with the finding a music tutor for the Princess Elizabeth. But just that depiction of Constanze as like someone who herself is not a composer, but is aware of, through her sisters and through other musicians she knows, like she is aware of how things work.
Yeah,
and
she's knowledgeable, I think.
Yeah.
And I think in general, if you have a partnership where one person is like the creative, it's really beneficial if the other person is like the manager. If the other person has the like basic skills to like, let's pay our bills. Let's like fill out this grant application. Like, I think that's helpful to have that person.
And money does come up a lot in Mozart's letters. I mean, in Mozart's letters, period. But in Mozart's letters to Constanze. And so, like I said, there's sort of multiple ways of reading this. There's sort of the romanticization of, oh, they were always, these sort of impoverished artist types, which seems to likely be an exaggeration for the reasons I mentioned. But there's also a like, oh, he, trusts his wife to talk about money with her, which was not something all 18th century husbands did.
Yeah, no, exactly. So that's like, it's so tricky to parse out who she was and what she was like when so much of it is in context of her relationship. But yeah, exactly like you said, like he trusts, like we know what he wrote to her. He's like, hey, I'm writing this opera. I'm applying for this job. Here's some facts about money. And that shows that she was interested in that. And he trusted her and could rely on her to have these conversations. So we just sort of like can infer from that what she was kind of like, because not having her own answers, like not having her letters to see what she said.
Right, exactly.
So then, because this is the Marie Antoinette / revolutionary season, I have this new segment called Nothing But Net, where I look to see how do people connect with Marie Antoinette, because I'm talking about all kinds of people from all kinds of places this season, not necessarily, frankly, nobody from France in this portion of the season. So I was trying, and I checked with you beforehand, like what is the most direct way to connect Constanze to Marie Antoinette? And I think it was that when he was in his child prodigy era, Mozart performed for Marie Antoinette, right?
He did. So I think just to remind people, Marie Antoinette herself was also not French. She was one of Maria Theresa's many, many children. And and so when the Mozarts were touring as child prodigies, they performed at Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna. And yes, so Mozart performed for the Habsburgs, including Marie Antoinette. There is this very adorable story that gets told a lot of times, although I don't believe it's mentioned in any of the Habsburg family writings. So people have sort of cast doubt on it, but there's this very cute story that like child Mozart trips on a rug or something, trips in the palace, and Marie Antoinette, or Antonia as she would have been known, kind of pre-marriage, helps him up, and he's, as a little kid, proposes marriage to her. And the story appears in all sorts of novels, and I believe it's in Amadeus as well. It's in the play for sure. I don't know if
they
it's
mention it in the movie. Yep.
Yeah, and this is. I think a lot of people like this story because it's cute and it opens up all sorts of like, oh well, what if, and people love to what if both Mozart and Marie Antoinette as as kind of potentially doomed historical figures. So there's that. There's also the fact Marie Antoinette's brother, Joseph II, became emperor of Austria. And so when Mozart is writing operas and all of that, that's the emperor in Amadeus. That Mozart and Salieri are working for. That's him. And that comes up a bit too when they're talking about Marriage of Figaro. And my sister Antoinette is very concerned about all of this, French thing, theater. So there's that. Well, I was just thinking, because we also talked a bit about, and we've talked a lot about rumor and gossip and anecdote and things. And I think it's a more tenuous connection. All of these connections with Constanze are tenuous, but I think both of these women were the subject of anecdotes and gossip, like during their lifetimes, but also especially after, in ways that have shaped kind of indelibly how they're talked about. And so like, no matter how many times people debunk things like the let them eat cake story, like you still have to bring it up because you mentioned Marie Antoinette and someone will think of it, even if we know it's not true. And I think with Constanze, we're sort of grappling to some extent with her depiction in Amadeus, but I think it has a much longer history as far as, how we read like the anecdotes and the gossip and the stories that she spread during her lifetime, and also how like images of her character and her relationship with Mozart developed in the decades and century after her death.
So I think Constanze's connection specifically directly to Marie Antoinette would be Mozart met Marie Antoinette, and then also he was like, that was the emperor. So Constanze is connected to Mozart, Mozart's connected to Marie Antoinette. So that's two degrees of separation, effectively.
2 degrees, yes.
Between these two. But as you said, like thematically, philosophically, I do think there's some similarities there. And actually, I was just adding up her score. So she gets a total score of 28 on the Scandalicious scale. And I was seeing there's so many people on the scale now. So I kind of like to see, well, where does that put her and who's similar? And a name that I kept thinking when you were talking was Mary Shelley, because she was married to Percy Shelley for relatively a short time and spent the rest of her life trying to like publishing his books and helping his legacy. She has a 29. Constanze Mozart has a 28. So I feel like they have a similar, that part, like Mary Shelley is now remembered for her work and Constanze is not, but I think both of them dedicated their post-marriage life to just like establishing a legacy for their husband's work.
Yeah, and so much speculation. Like I know with the Shelleys and with Lord Byron about, or like, what were the relationships there?
Yeah.
But yeah, there's so much potential for gossip. And yeah, that's really interesting that she's sort of right in there.
Exactly. They landed in a similar spot. I feel like where she edged ahead was Mary Shelley had more scandal because she like.
Yeah, I was going to say there were no, pre-existing spouses or.
No, there was no like running away in a throuple when you were 16.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Constanze was much more of a traditional narrative, traditional sort of person.
Yes.
Kristin, tell everybody. So first of all, the essay, like the thing that you wrote about Constanze Mozart, where can people find that?
Yeah, so it's in Grove Music Online, which is a peer-reviewed music encyclopedia. It's individual subscriptions are very expensive, so I would check and see. A lot of academic and public libraries subscribe to this. And what I wrote, it's the entry on Constanze Mozart, and it's an updated and expanded version of an article that was originally written in the late 90s, early 2000s, by Rudolf Angermüller, who was a scholar of Mozart and Salieri's work. And my contribution is the sort of thematic, talking about gossip and talking about the role of fiction in Constanze's posthumous legacy. And this is part of, so Grove as an encyclopedia has been around for well over a century. It started as a dictionary written by Sir George Grove in Britain in the late 19th century. And it's since gone through many different versions and is now online. And historically speaking, it hasn't always had the greatest coverage of women in music history. And so there's this great initiative right now where they're trying to improve their coverage of topics related to gender and sexuality. And so I, in my other research project on the history of queer musicology, had proposed a couple of places where either new articles could be written or existing articles could be improved. And I was meeting online with a couple of the editors, and they were asking, are there any other articles, that you use in your teaching or your research that you think should be updated? And just off the top of my head, I was like, well, I know the one on Constanze Mozart is quite a few years old. It could probably be updated. And at the time, I thought for sure they would go find an established Mozart scholar to write this. And they were like, oh, well, you're working on this stuff about rumor and gossip, and do you want to do it? And so, which was a phenomenal, I really enjoyed working on this and getting into making connections between some of the fiction and anecdote I'm working with and new developments in musicology and the biographical literature. And so that was just a great experience. And I'm very glad that they're sort of making the effort to diversify and expand kind of what a music encyclopedia should cover. Because traditionally, this encyclopedia, a lot of the entries on women connected to important men in music were like, oh, this person was a singer and she sang this important role in this dude's opera. And then she retired when she was 30. And we're just not going to talk about that she lived for however many more years.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think they're really trying to give a better sense of how people like Constanze fit into these bigger narratives of how music happens and how music history is talked about.
That's so interesting, and I'm good for them, frankly.
No, it's a really great initiative.
Yeah. And do you have any, I don't know, website or social media or anywhere if people want to connect with you or see what you're up to?
Yeah, so I am currently still on Twitter at Musicology Geek, and I'm on Blue Sky at KM Franseen. So if you look up Kristin Franseen, or quite frankly, if you look up Salieri operas or things. I mostly post about research I'm currently doing about Salieri and musical fiction, and also occasional fun maple drinks I try in Montreal. So,
Oh, nice. Yeah.
and then I do have a website connected to the book, which I am blanking on the URL off the top of my head. But my book is called Imagining Musical Pasts. And so if you Google that and my name, the companion website to the book should come up. It's through the Humanities Commons.
I'll put the link in the show notes and everything.
Oh, excellent. Thank you.
Yeah. Is the book available, or is it a work in progress?
The book is available. Yeah. It's through Clemson University Press. So it's an academic book on sort of the history of queer musicology. And it's currently quite expensive, but in a couple of years, it will be open access, because there is a program I'm participating in through JSTOR, where after 3 years, the ebook will be open access. So,
oh, wonderful! But also, if people can, a university library would be the sort of place where they could probably find the book.
Yeah. University library should be able to get access to it. So, if you want to read more about other kinds of musical scandal and gossip, that's available there.
That's where that all is. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. Constanze Mozart is, again, I think like a lot of people, I was just like, oh, she's that like cute person in Amadeus. Like she's kind of his bubbly, sweet wife.
She wears very revealing dresses. And
she has some real low cut dresses. Yeah. That she's really cute and spectacular cleavage in that movie. But now it's good to know who actually actual Constanze was. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you. This was great.
So, to keep up with this podcast and to see what is happening and what more teasers for upcoming episodes and stuff like that, well, first of all, I do have my Patreon, which I mentioned, which is patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter. And so I am posting just kind of like some discussions and stuff there. When you join the Patreon for at least $1 or more a month, you get to join a chat, like an episode discussion chat. So I love to hear what people are thinking about this season and stuff. But there's also, I'm posting some content there, just like some pictures and things. That's if you can join the Patreon for free as well. You get a free 7-day trial. Anyway, I'm pushing the Patreon, especially right now, because I'm so close to having 600 followers on Patreon, and I just like even numbers, frankly. So if you pledge $5 or more a month to join the Patreon, you get access to early ad-free episodes. Did I say $1 a month? You also get the early ad-free episodes. Early, ad-free, episodes for any paid Patreon membership. For the $5 or more, you also get access to Vulgar Piece Theater, which is including the Amadeus episode, which I've talked about. And also, guess what? Coming up, an I, Claudius episode. If you want to just listen to just the Amadeus episode of Vulgar Piece Theater as well without like joining the Patreon, you can also just literally just purchase that as an episode for $5. So anyway, that's all at patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter. Oh, and also the people at the $5 or more level, I have a Discord, the Vulgar History Salon International, where I hang out there a lot and we just kind of talk about the episodes. I give some spoilers there about upcoming episodes, just in the spoilers thread. You don't have to read the spoilers. Anyway, I just really am happy to have found some ways to really connect with the listeners, with you, the Tits Out Brigade, because this season I'm trying something very new and different, and yet classic Vulgar History vibes. And I'm really, really interested to see what you all think and what suggestions you have for what people you think would also fit into this theme. I also want to mention our brand partner, Common Era Jewelry. So I always say this, but I mean it every time. Like, this brand partnership came together so organically. It was actually first some listeners, Tits Out Brigade members, saw an ad for them and were like, this made me think of you. And I was like, this makes me think of me too. So Common Era Jewelry is a small business. I think there's literally like 2 employees working for it. And what they do is they make beautiful jewelry inspired by women of history as well as from classical mythology. And you know what? Are there some pieces that are inspired by some of the women who are in I, Claudius? Friends, yes. They have a Livia pendant and also an Agrippina pendant. But they also have other people from history/classical mythology. There's a Sappho one for all my sapphics, Medusa for all my women with snakes on their heads, Aphrodite, and then also figures from classical history like Cleopatra, Boudica, Hatshepsut is there as well. Anyway, so if we're just talking about supporting human beings, this company, like I truly support. Like it's Tori is the owner, and then they make the pieces in New York City. All of their packaging is done by a little family-owned business in Chicago. Like it's I'm really happy. Like I love their jewelry in general. I possess a few pieces of it, but I also love the vibe and the concept and everything they're doing. You can also stay on trend with a Marie Antoinette type vibe with Common Era. They have, if you look up the painting Botticelli's Daydream, which is not a Marie Antoinette connected painting as far as I know, but it's got a Marie Antoinette vibe, and they take that painting and put it into like hair bows, scrunchies. It's really lovely. So anyway, their pieces are available in solid gold as well as in more affordable gold vermeil. Vulgar History listeners always get 15% off anything from Common Era by going to commonera.com/vulgar or using code vulgar at checkout. If you want to get Vulgar History merchandise, which at this point is kind of like the Vulgar History Classique collection. I haven't figured out yet what the season 7 merch is going to be. And that's partially because this is why I want to have ways to get feedback from all of you. What do you think? Because I really want to find out like what concept, what's going to really resonate with people. And then I'll find one of my artist friends to draw that up. And then we'll have merch probably midway through the season. So anyway, but if you want to get the classique Vulgar History merch, go to vulgarhistory.com/store if you're in the US. If you're not in the Americas, America, if you're not in the US, go to vulgarhistory.redbubble.com. Other people in the Americas should probably also go there. Only United States people get really good shipping from vulgarhistory.com/store. Anyway, in both places, we've got t-shirts, we've got stickers, travel mugs, like pins, just cute things with some phrases from past episodes of Vulgar History, as well as sometimes when I get a silly review, like somebody on Apple Podcasts says that I'm unscholarly and rambling. I hired an artist to turn that into a cute little Lisa Frank sort of design, and you can get that on a t-shirt. You know what? And anyway, I keep saying I want to be in touch with you, and I do. So you can send me DMs. My DMs are open on Instagram, where I am at Vulgar History Pod. Also go there for like pictures and stuff, discussions. I put polls in the stories and things like that. You can also go to vulgarhistory.com, my website, where there's a little form where you can email me if you have thoughts or questions or whatever. And I also have a newsletter on Substack, which is sort of like a sister to this podcast. It's not just like take the podcast and write the words and make it a newsletter. I'm talking about completely different stuff on there. But it's more just kind of like if you like my whimsical feminist historian vibe, maybe you want to read my newsletter too. So that is at vulgarhistory.substack.com. Anyway, next week, season 7 continues. How do you solve a problem like Marie Antoinette, let them eat cake, Revolution Internationale. And we're going international because next week, when you think of Marie Antoinette in the 18th century age of revolution, obviously you think about New Zealand. Or maybe you don't. But now you will, because next week we're going to be talking about Tits Out Women from New Zealand history. I know there's listeners in New Zealand who have been for literal years. New Zealand listeners are some of my day one Tits Out Brigade members, and they've been politely requesting and suggesting New Zealand-based episodes for quite a while, and I was really happy to finally be able to bring you this New Zealand content. So until next week, everyone keep your pants on and your tits out. Vulgar History is researched, written, and hosted by Anne Foster. That's me. The editor is Christina Lumagi. Theme music is by the Severn Duo. The Vulgar History show image is by Deborah Wong. Transcripts are written by Aveline Malik. Find transcripts of recent episodes at vulgarhistory.com.
Talmor, Sheshin Murachi. Talmor is my home. My family have worked the land for generations. My gran says the island does not belong to us, but we belong to the island. And we must be ready, for a great evil is coming, and death follows with it.
Listen and subscribe to the latest season of Undertow, The Harrowing, a Storyglass production presented by Realm, available wherever you get your podcasts.
Contained herein are the heresies of Radolf Buntwine, erstwhile monk turned traveling medical investigator. Join me as I study the secrets of the divine plagues and uncover the blasphemous truth that ours is not a loving God, and we are not its favored children. The heresies of Radolf Buntwine, wherever podcasts are available.
I'm Brennan Storr.
I'm Paul Bestall.
We're the Ghost Story Guys.
And every 2 weeks, we explore first-person stories of encounters with the paranormal from all around the world.
Then we have some fun reacting to those stories. We like to say our goal is to scare the hell out of you, then make you laugh.
Belief in the paranormal is not required. All you need is a love of great storytelling and curiosity about the world around you.
Subscribe to the Ghost Story Guys now on your favorite podcatcher to hear episodes like High Strangeness in Chicago, The Mystery of Missing Time, and The Haunting of Vietnam, along with dozens of others.
We've talked about mythical bridges, doppelgangers, haunted seaside towns, and so much more.
Remember that story about the guy who was trapped inside a dream and something was hunting him? That was upsetting.
Yes it was.
Want us to help ruin your sleep? Come find the Ghost Story Guys on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else fine podcasts live, or at ghoststoryguys.com.